Kathleen and Rick. I just want to begin with a message I just received from a good friend of mine. She's a girl, a woman I've known since high school. She's not political, but we lost track of each other, and she found me on Facebook when I was living in Gaza. And she's asked me questions every now and then about Gaza and now about Syria. She just sent me a message saying, "Hello, my dear, thinking about you a lot lately. Your heart must be breaking as Syria is being destroyed. Sending love and hugs." And this is a good person, a well-intentioned person. She knows how much I care about Syria and the people of Syria. And I messaged back and said, "No, I'm overjoyed. Aleppo is liberated. The people of Aleppo are overjoyed." And I said, "Please, I'll tell you when I'm home. We'll talk when I'm home, but don't believe what you're hearing in the media. I know for a fact the majority of the people of Aleppo are overjoyed. The people who are not overjoyed are the backers of this regime change operation, the people that are influenced by the Wahhabis and the Muslim Brotherhood or have a certain agenda. But I swear, I've been to Aleppo 4 times. The people there were waiting for this moment, for Aleppo to be liberated and united. And on that note, I want to make a point about Aleppo. The corporate media has called Aleppo, okay, first of all, when they refer to Aleppo, they meant the pockets of Aleppo occupied by militant or terrorist factions. They didn't mean greater Aleppo, which comprised at least 1.5 million people. So that's why you would hear all these myths, which I'll be getting into, the last doctors, the last hospitals, the last clown, the last kitty cat. I mean, it got quite absurd.
Oh,
But they were referring specifically to the eastern areas of Aleppo occupied by militants. And even then, their facts weren't accurate. But that's one point. The other point is when they would actually acknowledge that another Aleppo exists, they call it East Aleppo and West Aleppo. They made it divided, and Syrians resisted this. They say, "We're not divided, we are united." And they say this all about Syria, all around. We're united in faith. We don't buy into this sectarian BS between, Sunnis against Shias or Sunnis against Alawis. This was never an issue in Syria, and they continue to reject it. And I think Rick had this experience, and I know I've had it. I've been to Syria 6 times since 2014. Everywhere I've gone, people always answer their faith is Syrian before they will actually tell me if they're Christian, Muslim, Sunni, Shia, Alawi, whatever. And then they tell me, I have a dear Shia friend. She keeps telling me how she celebrated all her Sunni and Christian friends' holidays with them. And they tell me about intermarrying. And I have friends who are Sunni and Alawi and intermarried, or Sunni and Shia and intermarried. So all this sectarianism that you hear about in the media it's from the media, and it's from the despotic regimes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. So those are some points. Now, this photo, and I have a few more I can show you, but this is a cooking gas canister. And I'm sure you're all aware that this is what's commonly used in the Middle East for cooking. There are varying sizes. Some are small, some are bigger than this, like in restaurants. The moderate democracy-bringing rebels have converted these into bombs, and for years have been firing on, let's take Aleppo for example. They've been firing for years, these of varying sizes, even including water heater, which are obviously quite larger. They fire them, and they're stuffed full of obviously explosives, but also bits of metal and shards to inflict more damage, much like a dart bomb, like the Israelis use on Palestinians, for example. And they're fired through something called a hell cannon. So they call these Hell 1s, and the larger ones, the water heater bombs, Hell 2. And the Hell 2s can actually take out entire levels of buildings. But even considering that they maybe only inflict a small bit of damage, or even considering they also use mortars, which are smaller and maybe only make a small hole in a building. One point that when I first went to Aleppo in July of this year, a doctor there, Dr. Nabil Antaki, he's on Facebook if you happen to be on Facebook. He speaks excellent English and French. And one point he made to me was, Eva, the physical destruction in areas of the East where the terrorists are, the physical destruction may be greater, but where we might have less physical destruction, our human destruction is more. Because one small mortar might make a hole but kill 5, 10 people at once. And as a personal anecdote, in July of this year, in a different area in Damascus, terrorists in the area of Jobra, which is to the east of Damascus, fired one mortar. I mean, they fired many, but one of the mortars hit a restaurant called the Qamar al-Sham, the Moon of Damascus restaurant. And inside there were a number of young women friends meeting, smoking shisha, drinking coffee, etc. And a woman with her infant son. 11 of these women, including the infant, were killed by this one mortar. So again, this rhetoric and this propaganda, when we see images of destruction, it exists. I'm not saying the destruction doesn't exist, but I'm saying these areas of eastern Aleppo, yes, there were civilians, but the areas that are being targeted are primarily, because this is a war against terrorism, terrorists who've invaded the country, the areas are primarily terrorist areas. Now, I went to an area called Leramun, which is in the north of Aleppo city. Leramun and Beni Zaid were some of the industrial districts in Aleppo. And Aleppo itself was the industrial hub of Syria. Since 2012, Aleppo had been occupied by militant factions, again in the north, in the east, in the south, and in the outskirts. The people of Aleppo had rejected this phony revolution. They never bought into it, and it was inflicted upon them even though they rejected it. Their industries were devastated. Thousands of factories were destroyed and looted and taken to Turkey. Those that weren't destroyed, machinery, including heavy machinery, including, as one of the Aleppo, the head of industry there told me, large machinery like transformers were taken on trucks along the highway into Turkey with Erdogan's permission and willingness, and certainly his backing. So Aleppo was thieved of its industry, and if it wasn't stolen, it was destroyed. In this district of Leramun, when I was there, I went there in August and I went back in November. And in November, I was with a group of Western journalists who wanted to go to Aleppo, and that visit was facilitated by the Syrian government because they want people to see the truth. And we went 3 stories down below ground in a building which above ground was badly damaged by airstrikes. Below ground, 3 stories down, where the Free Syrian Army had constructed a prison for Syrian Army soldiers, including homemade solitary confinement booths, 9 of them. Below ground was perfectly intact. So this should tell the average person, and certainly an investigative journalist like Anne Bernard of the New York Times, it should tell you that below ground everything is intact, and that's why the damage is so hard above ground, because the terrorists are bunkering below ground. And this is a point that a Syrian I was with made to me as we went through Homs. And I'm sure you're aware that Homs at one point was dubbed the capital of the revolution, was heavily infested by militant factions. And there was a lot of destruction because the Syrian army and allies were fighting against terrorists. And he pointed out, even without reconciliation, we wouldn't have ridded the terrorists from Homs. And the reconciliation involved either militants that were Syrian laying down their arms and being granted amnesty by the Syrian government, or given the option to be transported to a different area of Syria. And this is another option that's happened in Aleppo as well. But his point was, yes, there's destruction. Without the reconciliation, those militants would have been underground and still firing the bombs that they're doing the same way that they're doing in Aleppo. So the point is, when we were there in Leramun, okay, we're underground, we notice that everything's intact, but when they write about it, they just talk about the physical destruction, as if it's the government's intent just to destroy its own country. Now, Rick was talking about different forms of propaganda and vilification, and how it's absolutely necessary. If the West wants to impose regime change, you have to vilify the government, the army, one person, Bashar al-Assad. He has to be the most villainous person in the world at this point in time. And you take any context out of the situation. You take out of the situation the fact that terrorists from over 100 countries have infiltrated into Syria, largely through Turkey, also Iraq, also Jordan, through Jordan, the borders, and this is what the army and allies are fighting. None of this context is given in corporate media reporting. They're all glorious rebels. They're all revolutionaries that are bringing freedom to Syria. So this is one aspect of the freedom they were bringing. So these I actually took when I was going to visit the villages of Nubal and Zahra. These villages were for 3.5 years under siege by different terrorist factions. They're just about 15 kilometers north of Aleppo, and you will never have heard of them, most likely, in the corporate media, because they were not Sunni villages, they were supportive of the government, and they didn't fit the agenda. What fit the agenda was to talk about terrorists as if they're civilians, and to talk about a siege on terrorists as if it's not a normal military tactic. Now, if there were a group of terrorists in the US, you can bet the army would surround them and probably eradicate them completely. I highly doubt that there would be any option to transport the terrorist from, where are we now, from city A to city B, which the Syrian government has given this option. I just want to forward through a few slides to give you a bit more of a taste of what I was seeing. Oops, how am I gonna do this? Oh no. Oh good, okay. Just some more examples of the gas canister bombs I was seeing as I went to the villages of Nubal and Zahra. Now, I'm going to get back to those villages, but this is in a main park in Aleppo. I'm standing in a crater of one of their bombs, and the security in that park told me at least 40 had hit that park. They estimated 40 to 50 over the years. It might seem an insignificant amount, but in July this year, on a Friday afternoon, women were sitting on a bench just to the right of this bench. And as they sat there, the terrorists fired a rocket at the park. And 2 women and a child sitting on the bench were shredded by the shrapnel from the rocket. And these, in the parks, many people who are displaced from other areas of Aleppo go to the parks in the summer because they're largely living in shelters or with families or in very overcrowded situations. So they go to the park to escape, the crowded situation they're living in. And they go to the park and they're displaced and they get hit again, they get attacked again by these terrorists that the West dubbed as moderates. Another point I want to make, so I mentioned displaced people. This is one of 20 residences on the University of Aleppo campus. 16 of those 20 residences are housing displaced people from other areas of Aleppo. So people who have fled the presence of terrorists or the fighting against the terrorists. And the people, when I went there, they told me that roughly 15,000 people were living in these 16 buildings. Now, if you look up at the top right corner, you can see a hole. A week prior to me visiting there, terrorists had fired a rocket and it entered, you can see where that hole is, it hit there and killed 4 people from one family, displaced people that had been living there. And this is a common theme in Aleppo that, again, you will never hear about. Look, the hole is quite small compared to some of the devastation you might see in corporate media, but again, it killed a family. This was in July, on my first visit to Aleppo. So you can see a plume of smoke. That was roughly half a kilometer away at the main train station. It's no longer in function, but it's no longer functioning. But it's an area that's densely packed. So this was in the afternoon during Ramadan, but there were still people on the street. I don't actually know how many people might have been killed or injured. This is just an example of the type of bombings that occur on a daily basis in Aleppo. Actually, 15 minutes later, an explosive bullet landed about 15 meters away from me. So these are, I don't know much about military weaponry, but explosive bullets apparently are anti-aircraft bullets that are fired at helicopters or aircraft, I guess, and they explode in the air. So this one did that and then landed around 15 meters away. If it had landed a few meters in one direction, it would have hit one of the parked cars and exploded, and I probably wouldn't be here. The next day, after I'd left Aleppo, a dear friend of mine told me his mother had been killed by one of these explosive bullets. So again, the people of Aleppo for years have been facing this terrorism, and it's been largely unreported in the corporate media. The head of forensics in Aleppo, Dr. Zahar Hajo, told me that 11,000 civilians, not including army personnel, 11,000 civilians have been killed in Aleppo by these types of attacks in the last 5 years. And this is all documented, they have it recorded, so this is not a number he pulled out of the air. On November 3rd, so I mentioned some Western journalists. On my 3rd visit to Aleppo, I had permission to go as a journalist, but at the same time I learned there was a delegation of journalists who wanted to go. So I went with them. I was interested to see, what would they report going to the same areas. And that's still a project. I've been on the road. I haven't had a chance to really follow up. I intend to do so, but I've seen a little bit. I've gotten a taste. On November 3rd, there were a series of coordinated attacks on the city. They included car bombs, or rather large vehicle bombs, a barrage of Grad missiles across the city on residential and neighborhoods, snipings, explosive bullets, mortars, gas canisters. Wow. So we happened to be talking with the director of the main hospital, the Razi hospital. We were just trying to get a sense of, what it was like in Aleppo, asking questions about the hospital. He talked about the effects of the Western sanctions on the hospital, the lack of machinery and medicines due to the criminal sanctions. He talked about people that were injured by toxic gas attacks. So we always hear about chemical weapons. They've never substantiated their accusations against the Syrian army doing chemical weapons attacks, But to the contrary, we've seen a lot of evidence that the militants have perpetrated these attacks, including in 2013. Carla Del Ponte, a UN investigator, said, yes, all fingers point to the rebels having had access to sarin. And then, of course, Seymour Hersh wrote about that. But anyway, when we were talking with them about gas attacks, they said they believed that chlorine and mustard were being used by the terrorists. Then one of the journalists said, well, why don't you know? And he said, well, we don't have the means to actually test. We don't have the facilities because of the sanctions. But anyway, just on a side note, on my second visit in November, so my fourth visit to Aleppo, I was in the university hospital, which is the other main one there. And I was in the emergency room, and I saw people being treated for what was obviously a gas attack. They were being given oxygen, and they were having trouble breathing, looking like they were suffocating. On November 3rd, after we met with the doctor, the director of the hospital, some of the injured started rolling into the Razi hospital. And it took me back to when I lived in Gaza, because I was there during 2 major Israeli attacks in Gaza. And the scene of just car after car after car after ambulance rolling in and people dropping off the injured and more coming in. It was like that. This was a mother of one of the injured men, and she was sobbing and saying, screaming for somebody to do something. It was her only son. About half an hour or so later, we learned that he had died. And incidentally, he was a doctor. So again, we're always hearing about last doctors in Aleppo. He actually was a doctor. And there are many more. I have doctor friends after my visits there, and I've heard of many other doctors who have been killed. On this day, by the end of the day, 18 people, civilians, had been killed, and over 200 were injured, including many who were critically injured. I'm going to show a couple of photos. It does show, not in graphic detail, but you will see people who have been killed. So these people, we were at the morgue just around the corner from the hospital, and this man was brought in the back of a pickup truck. He was a civilian. And this man was brought in a car, and when he was taken into the morgue, the scene was a very dense area, people, mostly families of the martyred, standing around or sitting around sobbing and crying, so women and their children, and the bodies were being brought past them. And it just struck me how wrong in every sense this was, how wrong people were being killed, how wrong children were being exposed to these dead bodies. And when the man was brought past, I swore he was decapitated. But it might have been the angle of the shirt. He might not, the Dr. Zahar Hajo of the forensics maintained that he probably wasn't decapitated, but nonetheless it was that gruesome. Later, when I mentioned that I was back at University Hospital in November, and so this is a week after the attacks, and I met some more people that had been injured in the attacks. So again, people that were in their homes when a mortar was fired at it, or a rocket in this case was fired at the house, or people that were in their homes and they were sniped by these freedom-loving rebels. This boy, for example, was sniped through his abdomen. And when I met him, I actually met him on 2 occasions. I met him this day, and the next day I happened to be back at the hospital interviewing the director of the hospital. And the director took me around to see some more of the injured, and we went back to this room. And I was with an emergency room doctor, and when the boy saw the emergency room doctor, he started freaking out because he associated him with his entrance into the hospital. And he was being given oxygen, and he just started squealing in fear. And this boy, I think he was, I can't remember how old he was. I think maybe 7 years old. And he was at his home when he was sniped by terrorists. Now, we hear a lot about hospitals being attacked. This one was a maternity hospital. It's called the Dabit Maternity Hospital. It's a private hospital. On May 3rd, terrorists fired a rocket which landed on a parked car right outside the hospital. And it exploded, and 2 neighboring cars exploded. The hospital was internally gutted, and 3 women were killed. And yet, with all the cries of hospitals hit, this never made the media. Also notable, actually very notable, so the director of the university hospital used to be the director of a hospital called the Kindi Hospital. And the Kindi Hospital was the largest and best cancer treatment hospital in the Middle East. In 2012, it was taken over by terrorist factions, and the director talked to whoever he could, and he told me, I talked to the WHO, I talked to whatever institution I could and asked them to do something, give me back my hospital. He said he didn't get a response. In 2013, December, the terrorists of al-Nusra truck bombed and destroyed the hospital. Now, amazingly, so not amazingly, it got little to no notice, little to no condemnation of the sort we're hearing now on feigned or manufactured atrocities. But what I was going to say is, amazingly, this year there's been a lot of rhetoric about the Syrian army or the Russians targeting hospitals. And this, what month are we, December? So I think it was in early November, I saw on, I want to say CNN or Fox, they actually showed a photo of the destroyed Kindi hospital. They said it was in eastern Aleppo and then it was destroyed by the Syrian regime. Yeah. So this is how transparent, this is one example of many of how transparent the media lies are. The fact that they'd show an old photo and claim it was a new one and that it was destroyed by the Russians or the Syrians. There are other examples. In April of this year, in a concentrated effort overnight, every single major media outlet and supposedly independent outlets were talking about a hospital called the Quds Hospital. They were claiming it was destroyed, they were claiming it was targeted by airstrikes, and yet when a Russia TV reporter showed photos of the Russian Ministry of Defense, satellite photos, she showed it, and she showed the hospital as it was photographed at the time, and the hospital as it was photographed by satellite in October 2015, and they were in the same, it was in the same physical state. So she was like, how has it been attacked by airstrikes if it's in the same state? It didn't matter, and the state person that she was addressing the question to just deflected, as they do. The Guardian, which took part in these lies saying Quds Hospital was targeted and destroyed, this is back in April. In September, the Guardian forgot that it had said that and said the Quds Hospital was treating chlorine victims. So, I mean, again, they don't really care that their lies are inconsistent because they're not expecting people to be paying attention. So I mentioned Nubal and Zahra, the villages that were under siege for 3.5 years. People didn't have access to medical care, to basic food and medicine. Sometimes they were able to get supplies airdropped by the Syrian army, but they were subject, because they were living in such dire circumstances, they developed all sorts of treatable diseases. And this boy had one example. I forget the medical name, but it occurs when you're living in an area that has piles of garbage and some sort of sandfly or something lives in that circumstance. And it is treatable, but anyway, he's just one example. The women, they were talking about the hardships they faced in the cold in winter, not having fuel to keep their homes warm, not being able to feed their children, etc. And this boy, this story is notable. So he's burned. You can see his face is badly burned by, it was some sort of blast that landed, some sort of attack, or bomb, sorry, that landed near him and burned his face. But what was interesting about his story was that he and his grandfather next to him were actually from Idlib province, which is to the west of Aleppo. And they're Sunni. And they fled Idlib because the rebels had taken over Idlib. And they fled and they ended up in Aleppo, and then they ended up in Nubal and Zahra. Nubal and Zahra, now I'm going to get it mixed up, I think they are Shia villages. So anyway, I don't get into the sectarianism, but I'm mentioning this for a point. These Sunnis fled the terrorists, they went to Aleppo, and they went to a Shia village where they were welcomed, and yet they were still attacked. The point being, it's not about Sunnis versus Alawis or Sunnis versus Shia. It's about people fleeing or trying to fight against the terrorists. Now I'll get back to Aleppo. So I mentioned military siege as a tactic of war, and I'm not a war expert, but it's quite clear that if you have terrorists as well. I met 2 families when I was there in November who told me they had fled eastern areas of Aleppo occupied by terrorists. They had tried to flee before. One family was stopped twice. The other family was stopped, I think, 4 times prior, prevented from leaving. And they talked about what life was like there and how the terrorists basically hoarded the food, kept them in prison, prevented them from leaving. They also told them they fear-mongered them. They basically told them, if you go to the regime, quote unquote, they're going to kill you, they're going to rape your women. They tried to make them scared and afraid to leave. And in some cases this works, and in some cases they don't believe it. But the main fact is that they are the ones that controlled the food and the medicines and everything, and they're the ones that prevented people from leaving. And again, this is one example of them preventing. You can find many examples online of them firing upon people as they try to leave. And you can also find examples of the Syrian army shielding people as they're being fired on and fleeing from these areas. So now almost all of Aleppo is liberated. I think there's still some pockets, one pocket maybe, where there are militant factions who were supposed to partake in a deal to have them bust out of the area, but they refuse. But of the estimated 95,000, say 100,000 people that have fled the areas occupied by terrorists in eastern Aleppo, the vast majority, if you're watching online on social media or any of these people that I've mentioned, are saying we wanted to leave and saying, thank God the Syrian army liberated us. When the villages of Nubal and Zahra were liberated from the siege, they were saying the same thing, thank God the Syrian army liberated us. And you won't have seen it on corporate media because it didn't fit their agenda. But if you're watching any of the sources I've mentioned and Syrian reporters, you would have seen things that cannot be feigned, scenes of ecstatic, jubilant people. And the way our media reports it is, well, they're forced, they have to act this way. You can tell when people are ecstatic and jubilant and actually cheering for their liberation and when they're being forced, and these were not being forced. In June 2014, I went to Homs. I mentioned a little bit ago, Homs was dubbed the capital of the revolution. When I went in June, it was a month after a deal which saw the remaining militants in the old city be taken out of Homs and sent to Idlib or somewhere. And so I went and met with a family that had stayed in Homs, the Akhras family, a brother and sister, and they were emaciated. Although they had put on weight in the months since they'd been liberated, they were very emaciated, and they said the terrorists came to our house over 40 times and they stole every last morsel of food. Many of the people had fled the old city of Homs fearing for their lives. Others stayed because they wanted to protect their homes. Some of those who fled brought their belongings, their valuables, to a priest, a Dutch priest that was living there, Father Frans van der Loot. And he basically was keeping them safe. At some point, and now there's different stories, but what I heard when I went there and talked with friends of Father Frans and locals of the old city, their story was that there was more than one reason that he was sat down in a chair and assassinated point blank. And he was in his 60s or 70s, had been there for decades. One of the reasons was he wouldn't give the valuables to the terrorists. And the other reason was because he was telling the truth about what was happening there. Father Franz, from his writings, you could tell he was not pro-government. And he wasn't pro-rebel. He was just a person living there and reporting what he saw. He started writing early on saying, from the beginning, I saw armed men in the protests. And this is a theme in my visits to Syria and talking with people around the country. This is a theme that I've heard from them. And this is something that's now amply documented. I'd highly recommend Sharmeen Narwani. She's an excellent author, very well sourced. And she's written, a couple of years ago, she wrote an article called The Hidden Massacres. Very well sourced, and it talks about the early massacres which occurred, in 2011, which we would never hear about because some of these exile Syrians with their Saudi and Gulf and American and Israeli backers and Turkish backers maintained that for the first year or the first 7 months, the protests were completely peaceful. They were just chanting for political change, and this is not true. From the beginning, although there were people in the streets that were protesting for political change, and there might be people in the streets that did want Bashar to go, but from the beginning, there were also people who were armed, and there were people who were shooting on unarmed security forces. And there were people, many of them, who were saying, kill the Alawis, and the Christians must be driven out of Syria. And there's variations of it, Alawis to the grave, Christians to Beirut. But it's clear these were slogans that were not coming from Syria. These are slogans that are coming from outside, sectarian slogans. And now there's a sheikh, Adnan Arur, who basically has called for Alawis to be ground up in a meat grinder and fed to the dogs. I mean, this kind of despicable sectarianism is being supported wholeheartedly and funded by these Gulf states and also by the West. But the people that I've met, many of them said, when the protests started, we were hopeful for change because we want change and we need change. But very quickly on, we realized this was not going to bring the change we wanted. And very quickly, we realized what kind of revolution destroys its own heritage, slaughters its own people, and attacks its own infrastructure. Clearly, nobody who wants political change would go to that extent. But people who are working for an agenda, whether they know it or not, would do so. Sorry. So this is one of the families that I met from eastern areas of Aleppo. He was from an area called Al-Halak, which was in the northeast of Aleppo. And they had, I met him on November 10th. He and his wife and kids and about 40 others had seized an opportunity when there was fighting between the Syrian army and terrorists within. And in that confusion, they were able to escape. And they were able to, he coordinated with a Syrian army officer saying, there's a group of us coming out, and they were checked to see if they had any weapons, and then they were given medical care and given shelter. Okay, so I have a ton more photos I could show you, but I just wanted to talk about a few more things related to Aleppo, because Aleppo is something that we're hearing a lot about in the media. I'm just going to unplug this if I may, because my computer, it's a bit too confusing to. So anyway, in terms of getting some news from sources that you trust, or sources that are not Russia Today, if you don't necessarily trust them, although I do, I would recommend highly looking at Vanessa Beeley. She's on Facebook, Beeley. She's also a contributor to 21st Century Wire. And she's telling you, it's for you to believe, but she's documented it with photos, and she has many videos she has yet to upload. And I know she's taken the testimonies of people. And today she posted that in the center that was taking in people that were displaced from eastern areas of Aleppo, they estimated 95,000 people had been registered at that center. And she said that maybe another 10,000, maybe more, had not gone to the center. They'd gone directly to families or relatives. But even if we assume 100,000 have left eastern areas of Aleppo, for years the United Nations and corporate media and human rights groups have been screaming 250,000 starving civilians in eastern Aleppo. So now there's a small pocket, I think it's like 2 square miles or something, in which there are still some militants. Are we really to believe that another 150,000 people are standing in that 2 square mile or whatever it is area? The UN would have us believe that. And I want to make another point about the UN. December 13th, I'll look at my notes and get you the name if you want it, but a spokesperson for the UN, and this is the basis of, if you're seeing reports now of massacres in Aleppo, instead of hearing about the liberation of Aleppo, you're hearing about 82 people slaughtered, among them women and children, and this source comes from the spokesperson for the UN. Now, if you read his statement, he doesn't name a single source. He says, "We were told, sources say." That is not credible. You cannot make these statements without naming who has told you this. And he's the single source for all the reports you're seeing in the Independent, BBC, Guardian, Democracy Now! And this is being used to vilify the Syrians and the Russians at a time when the people in Aleppo themselves are cheering for being liberated. In terms of other myths prior to Aleppo, in January of this year, there was a concerted media campaign. Overnight, everybody was talking about a place called Madaya, which was just outside of Damascus. And everybody was saying 40,000 starving civilians in Madaya. And again, all fingers were pointing at the Syrian government, blaming them of starving civilians in Madaya, of killing its own people. The media ignored the fact that the Red Cross, the ICRC spokesperson in October 2015 had said, with the aid, permission, etc., of the Syrian government, we sent in enough aid and supplies to last for 3 months. You can Google this, you can find it. He said that the people inside should have had enough aid to survive for 3 months until presumably the next shipment. And yet in January, all reports were saying 40,000 starving civilians in Madaya. So what happened? Was it really 40,000? That number we can't even ascertain now because the terrorists are still within Madaya, but now it's no longer a talking point. Nobody cares about Madaya. Yeah. But what we do know was in January, aid again went into Madaya, again an effort of the UN, Red Cross, Red Crescent. And with the aid, some journalists were able to go in and they were able to interview people. And the people inside were saying, the terrorists are stealing our food. They're selling it at rates we cannot afford. They're selling it at 4 times their cost. And they're saying, you can even see people inside Madaya had filmed them protesting the presence of the terrorists. And yet, we never heard about this in the corporate media. And even though an established, spokesperson of an established international organization said, we sent the aid in, the Syrian government was blamed. The same thing happened in Yarmouk. Yarmouk at one point was a trendy thing to talk about. All the media, all the human rights organizations, all the supposed, activists were talking about Yarmouk. Now nobody talks about Yarmouk. There are still terrorists in Yarmouk, but it's like, in fact, I don't even know, it might be 80% or 85% now occupied by terrorists. And situation is hellish there, but the majority of the people have been taken to shelters, and they were evacuated incrementally when possible to shelters by the Syrian government and given the basics, given shelter, given food, medicine, and given school and education. Even Sky News at one point went into Yarmouk, and there's video footage of the Sky News reporter, I think it was Alex Thompson, in Yarmouk, and showing he was being fired upon with a group of people that were protesting the presence of the terrorists. We never heard about this. It was all the fault of the Syrian government for fighting terrorists in Yarmouk. In fact, in Yarmouk, it's an area that was a Palestinian area, roughly 170,000 Palestinian refugees, and 1 million Syrians. That's another aspect of Yarmouk. We never heard about the 1 million Syrians. It was only a Palestinian refugee camp, because this is an effort to divide Palestinian supporters and Syrian supporters, and to make it look like the Syrian government is targeting Palestinians. Well, Palestinians in Syria have equal rights as Syrian citizens. They don't in Lebanon, they don't in Jordan, but we never hear about that. In Syria, they have equal rights, education, healthcare, etc. But Yarmouk was used as a card to vilify the government and to divide people. And now nobody cares about Yarmouk, nobody cares about Madaya, and nobody cares about two villages called Fou and Kafraya. These villages are in Idlib province or governorate. They have been besieged, fully besieged, since March 2015. So that's what, 1.5 years now, right? Slightly more. For 1.5 years, they've been denied the entry of food aid, medicine, and vitals. Nobody will talk about these villages because they are not Sunni, because they do not fit this regime change agenda. The people in Fou and Kafraya are not only denied the basics of life, but on a daily basis they're fired at with snipers, with the bombs, the gas canister bombs, with conventional rockets and missiles and weaponry that the terrorists have gotten through Turkey. And I'll give you an example now of more media manipulation. If people heard of a boy named Amran, anybody hear about Amran? He was a cute boy, brown hair in a bowl cut, sat in an ambulance chair. Boy in the ambulance is how he came to be known. Because he sat in like a red-orange ambulance chair, a trickle of what looked like blood going down his forehead, blinking at the cameras that were taking photos of him instead of giving him medical care. And he was made to be this poster child of suffering, right? So there's many problems with this whole Amran story. It was another example of an overnight concerted, everybody's talking about it, Amran is on the front pages and etc. of all the corporate media and human rights groups. One problem was that as a medical professional, you don't sit a boy down and take photos of him, you give him care. If he's got blood going down his head, you treat the wound. You treat him for shock, because he's obviously going to be in shock. So you either give him oxygen or touch him, but you don't sit him down and do nothing. This is precisely what they did. Another problem was the main photographer of Amran was a man named Mahmoud Raslan. And he is a man that can be found taking selfies with a group called Nuruddin al-Zinki, who are a terrorist faction, which the West still will not call terrorists, they call them moderates. And this group is more well known for beheading a 12 or 13-year-old Palestinian boy, methodically sawing his head off. This is what the moderates that the West supports do. And Mahmoud Raslan can be seen taking selfies with some of these terrorists, including the terrorist who beheaded the boy Abdullah Isa. So Mahmoud Raslan is a photographer of Amran, who was not treated with proper medical care. At the same time that Amran's face was being splashed across newspapers, etc., with calls to do something, and the do something was always something like depose Assad and impose a no-fly zone so we can bomb the hell out of Syria and give them human rights and democracy. At the same time, in Fou and Kafraya, 2 boys named Laith and Muhammad were shot in the neck and were shot in the head. And the boy, I think it was Laith, 6 and 4 years old, that was shot in the head, was in critical condition for several days. And it looked like he was going to die, and he needed care outside of the villages but could not get out because of the siege on the villages. I didn't expect him to survive. He did survive.
Wow.
But this is just one example of how the media distorts reality. Amran with a trickle of blood, it could be real, it could be makeup, I don't know. Let's assume it's real. A trickle of blood coming down his forehead. And a boy who actually has, you can see the bullet wound in his head, and his brother, you can see the bullet wound in his neck. Both of them shot by a sniper. And nobody cares about them. Nobody cares about Abdullah Isa. And there's countless other examples of children that are actually injured by terrorists the West likes to call moderate rebels. And at the same time, we only hear about the Amrans, or the Ayas, or the Bana al-Abids, prolific 7-year-old kids that have Twitter accounts and call for no-fly zones and talk about genocide. A kid that on video can't even string an English sentence together, but on Twitter, she's prolific. And people believe this. It's phenomenal. I mean, Rick was talking about incubator babies and reminding how people believed this. People are believing a 7-year-old girl in an area that was besieged. And I've been to Aleppo, as I said, 4 times. Every time I've gone to Aleppo, it's been a struggle to even open my email, let alone to tweet like 200 times in 3 days, or however many times she does a day. It's not credible that she has that much internet access, that she can tweet so much. It's not credible that after opening her Twitter account in September, she immediately, after a couple of weeks, had 25,000 followers, including followers of different human rights groups, and that she can speak in such excellent English and call for basically no-fly zone. So this is another example of people. I mean, prior to that, there was someone called the Gay Girl in Damascus, and it turned out to be a man based where in the UK or somewhere. There have been many examples of manipulating people, well-intentioned people like my friend who said, Eva, I'm so sorry that Syria is being destroyed. People that, have families, have jobs, and don't have time to devote to actually discerning the lies. And, most of our sources that we're hearing about Syria from are not on the ground. And it's not because they don't get granted visas, it's because if they're on the ground, well, even if they're on the ground, they don't have to report the truth. But the fact is they don't need to be on the ground because they can write from Beirut or Washington or wherever, and they can cite unnamed activists, or they can cite the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is one person in the UK who relies on unnamed activists. They can cite the White Helmets, and they can cite any number of people that are not actually credible. The White Helmets themselves are not credible. They have been funded by the West. They were initiated by the West. They claim to be neutral, grassroots Syrian volunteers, and they claim to be present in Aleppo, rescuing hundreds of people. And yet none of the people that came out of eastern Aleppo know of the White Helmets. You can see photos of them, you can see slick documentaries of them, you can see nominations for Nobel Peace Prizes, but the people that they claimed to be working with and living with and saving do not know of them. So clearly, they're either not in Aleppo, or if they're there, they're doing these staged videos, but they're not actually saving people. Just as a side note, anybody who's ever worked with medics knows that a medic's uniform very quickly gets soiled with blood and dirt. This is what I saw in Gaza because I was working with medics. If you watch these White Helmets videos, they're always pristinely clean. This is just another element of the lack of credibility. But these are people we're supposed to believe are giving us the truth about Syria. And above all, we're not supposed to believe independent sources, or Russian media, or Syrian media. And I can name, if you actually want Syrian media, I can give you some good English language-speaking Syrian reporters working for, say, Press TV. He is Iranian, but these are people that are doing their job. There's Muhammad Ali. He works for Press TV. There's Ala Ibrahim. He works for both Press TV, CCTV, and he's independent. Excellent language reporters, English language reporters. And they've been in some of the hottest spots and the most contested spots in the media over the years of the war in Syria. I just want to look at my notes because I want to make sure I don't miss a few points more I want to make. Yalla. Okay, so just 1 second. The other point about no doctors is, I mentioned at the beginning, when the media was addressing Aleppo, they were ignoring greater Aleppo. And so this whole last doctor or no doctor thing, they didn't bother to talk with the Aleppo Medical Association, which has over 4,000 registered and active doctors. So it showed, I mean, Aleppo is more or less a functioning city, but again, it was being hammered by terrorist attacks on a daily basis. Since the terrorists took over pockets of Aleppo, the majority of the people were denied electricity and water because the water pumping station was in an area that terrorists occupied, as was the power station. Now the water pumping station is liberated, but the power station is still in an area, I think, controlled by ISIS. So for years, people have been without electricity. They've been buying from generators, those who could afford it. And they've been without running water, but relying on something like 300 wells dug by the Syrian government and private associations. And many of these wells have contaminated water, but people were drinking it because that's all they could get. So we've never, heard about the suffering of these people in Greater Aleppo, let alone the sieges they were put under, because there was only one small road leading to Aleppo, and on many occasions, terrorist factions cut that road off, meaning the people were actually under siege for weeks on end. This intentional and deliberate ignoring of the suffering of the people of Greater Aleppo is in line with all the lies we hear about Syria, including the myth about unarmed revolutionaries, the myth about the Sunnis against the Alawis, the Sunnis against the Alawi government, the myth about starvation. There are many myths, and we don't actually hear the real cases that are ongoing, in fact. Now, one other issue I just want to touch on briefly, and then I think I'll wrap it up and we can do Q&A, but the issue of refugees. This has been another card media and Western leaders have used to say, look at all these people, half the population is displaced, implying that half the population is outside of Syria, is fleeing the government, and that we have to do something, which is again probably a no-fly zone, to restore peace and security by bombing them like we did Libya. But in fact, maybe 4 million of those, say 12 million or 11 million, are displaced outside for various reasons, not just because some maybe are against the government, and some are fleeing the presence of the terrorists, and some have left for economic reasons to find work outside. But there's like 8 million within Syria being housed in governmental areas like Damascus, Latakia, Tartus, Sueda, and smaller hubs in Homs, in other areas of Syria. And we don't hear about these people because they're actually welcomed. They're in an area that is comprised of Sunnis, Alawis, Shias, Christians. They're living together in harmony, and they're given shelter in the basics by the government. And of course, this doesn't fit the narrative of a big bad government killing its people. There's, the Syria Solidarity Movement is, as Rick was saying, has organized my talks here, and there's also a coalition. Did you mention the Hands Off Syria Coalition?
No, I didn't, yeah.
Yeah. There's a Hands Off Syria Coalition which formed a few months ago, and I can give you, I have some printouts, I don't have a whole lot, but anyway, I'll point you to their website. It's handsoffsyriacoalition.net. And their forming is important because they bring together a number of groups that are anti-war, anti-imperialist, etc., that are that have agreed on many points of unity. And primary points being, we do not support Western intervention in Syria. We do not support funding of terrorists and arming of terrorists and whitewashing of terrorists in Syria. We respect the sovereignty of Syria. And these are points also the Syria Solidarity Movement adheres to. Respecting the sovereignty of the government of Syria. It's not for us to decide who to be their president, and it's certainly not for us to send terrorists or impose a no-fly zone on the country. The U.S. claims it's fighting terrorism in Syria. It claims it's fighting ISIS in Syria. And they have repeatedly asked the Syrian government to impose a ceasefire. And the Syrian government and Russians have actually done so. They did so in February, they did so in September. In the example of September, most famously, like 20 rebel groups declared they were not going to participate in the ceasefire. Terrorists within areas of eastern Aleppo declared they did not want UN food aid trucks to enter. They wanted weapons, and they said they would attack trucks that entered. And terrorists throughout Syria violated the ceasefire over 300 times, according to the Russian Reconciliation Center. But it wasn't only terrorists who violated the ceasefire, but the American-led coalition itself. On September 17th, they attacked a Syrian army position in Deir ez-Zor for almost 1 hour, on repeated attacks, killing at least 83 soldiers, Syrian soldiers. They later maintained they didn't know. This is not true. They were surveying the area before. They knew exactly who they're targeting. The Russians were calling them, telling them to stop attacking, but they weren't answering their phone. And immediately after they attacked this position, ISIS took over. And according to the Department of Defense website a couple of months ago, the US-led coalition had flown something like almost 15,000 sorties in Syria. And if they had actually been attacking ISIS, we wouldn't be having a problem with ISIS. They would have eradicated most of these terrorists, but they haven't been. They've been attacking Syrian infrastructure. They've attacked Syrian schools and villages. In Deir ez-Zor, they've bombed like 8 bridges, at least. So the point is, their entrance into the war on Syria is illegal. It's against international law. Syria didn't invite them. And on top of that, they're attacking Syrian positions. Whereas Syria invited Russia, and Russia is fighting terrorists. And I don't care about the policy. I'm not advocating for Russia. I'm just saying what is actually factual and what is legal. Russia's presence in Syria and any allies of Syria that are there, they were welcomed. And realistically, they're fighting terrorism. And I can't believe the hypocrisy of Western leaders and media and so-called human rights groups that are so busy right now condemning Syria and condemning Russia and manufacturing stories and saying they care about human rights and care about the people of Syria when they've been funding the terrorists that are slaughtering, beheading, and torturing the people of Syria. So I firmly believe that it's up to the people of Syria and that we have to stop supporting this intervention, but we also have to stop supporting this media that's lying about Syria and calling them out. Right now there is a concerted effort to completely ignore the fact that people in Aleppo are jubilant about their liberation, and instead to depict the Syrian government again as villains. So we really need to be challenging this. And the UN, I'm sorry, I mentioned earlier that they don't have sources when they say that the Syrians have massacred 82 people in eastern Aleppo. They have not named their sources. If they have them, please name them. But they've also ignored many resolutions prior that declare the US cannot arm terrorists in Syria. There's many. And it's just a farce to believe that they have the interests of Syrian people at heart. So I guess with that, I have a lot more I could say about travels in Syria, but I think it's probably good if we just open it up to Q&A.
Great.